Lesson 2, Part 1, The Whig World. 18th century Britain is often referred to as the Augustan Age, which points to the domination of the landed elite. Landed magnates dominated England from a pinnacle of wealth and power. Land, in the form of large estates, provided the wealth of rents coming from farmers, and power derived from the position of the landowner in the locality. The social structure of 18th century Britain was an open hierarchy, a status hierarchy, but not a class society. In one sense, of course, you can think of people in any society as a class. This makes sense to us in 21st century Canada. However, it is anachronistic to apply the category to this period, though it is this is my cat, Tasha, though it is increasingly applicable in the 19th century. Contemporaries in 18th century Britain related to each other in hierarchy, in an established order. That is, people thought of others and related to others in their communities in vertical rather than horizontal terms, with those above and below them more than with those with similar socio-economic place in life. In a class society, the emphasis is on those beside you rather than those above and below you. And in the 19th century, observers such as Karl Marx noted or promoted the idea of a solidarity with one's class. In 18th century society, there were degrees, orders, and ranks, not economic classes. In another metaphor, each person was assigned a position at birth in the social structure, like a ladder or a series of parallel ladders. As Samuel Johnson commented on people's place in the hierarchy, quote, "By the fixed invariable rules of distinction of rank which create no jealousy since they are held to be accidental." Johnson here overemphasizes the fixed nature of the hierarchy. It was a hierarchy, but not a caste system. Except for royalty, and in most cases the aristocracy, there could be social mobility upwards, and of course, downwards. The socio-economic goal in this period was to get land, to be a gentleman, and one definition of being a gentleman was that you didn't have to work for a living. This points to the importance of land, since owning a large estate of land meant you could rent it out to farmers who paid you rents, and hence your income from not working. Wealthy businessmen and industrialists would show that they had made it in society by buying a large landed estate. As Daniel Defoe noted, quote, "After a generation or two, the tradesmen's children, or at least their grandchildren, come to be as good gentlemen, statesmen, parliament men, bishops and noblemen as those of the highest and most ancient families." Take the example of Thomas Diamond Pitt. Born the son of an Anglican clergyman, he became a sea captain and trader with the East India Company, where he progressed, becoming a merchant and eventually director of the East India Company. He earned so much money with the company that he bought 10 estates in England and became a member of Parliament. The socio-economic structure of 18th century Britain can be thought of as a pyramid, with fewest people in the highest order of society and most at the lowest. At the pinnacle of the pyramid was the royal family, by definition a tiny number of persons. Next were the aristocracy, families who held a legal aristocratic title that was passed down to successive generations to the eldest son. All were great landlords owning vast estates of land, and increasingly city properties in London. These families lived in palatial country homes, often with more than 100 rooms. Their revenue came mostly from land rents. The Duke of Devonshire, admittedly a rare case, earned £30,000 a year off rent, the equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. Revenue was also raised by exploiting the natural resources on their lands, especially coal and other resources that were increasingly needed for industrial production once the Industrial Revolution took off in the later 18th century. The gentry comprised both the titled and non-titled. The titled gentry, baronets and knights, could not pass their titles on to their sons, as the aristocracy could. The gentry were in many ways the backbone of British society. They held lands and were large landlords, and filled many of the important local and legal offices, being such political and judicial offices such as the Justice of the Peace. They lived in country houses, enjoyed the title of gentleman, for those who are not titled. Being a gentleman meant having the ability to live well without working for a living. More numerous than the gentry were the farmers. There were two kinds of farmers. Legally, those who owned their own land, often called freeholders, and those who were tenant farmers. Freehold farmers could be like the gentry in many respects, though a major difference was that they actually managed their farms themselves rather than paying someone to do it for them. There were more tenant farmers than freehold farmers. Another group were often termed the middling sort. This was a growing element of society and numbered about 15% of the population. This group does not fit neatly in the social hierarchy, however, and was quite diverse. Generally speaking, it included the professions and also large merchants. At the time, there were only 5 recognized professions: the law, the church, medicine, the army, and the navy. Members of these professions could have a comfortable living, but their lack of wealth was somewhat compensated by the respect that their profession provided. Merchants in towns and cities could become very wealthy. Below the merchants were those with a skill, such as artisans, smaller shopkeepers, and tradesmen. At the low end of the middling sort were the tradesmen, and there were hundreds of individual occupations such as, but not certainly limited to, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, jewelers, goldsmiths, hatters, clockmakers, carpenters, shoemakers, saddlers, harness makers, gunsmiths, tailors, and so on. Below the middling sort were those who really worked for others, laborers and domestic servants. As Britain was primarily agricultural and pre-industrial farming, farm work was done by hand and done by a legion of lowly paid farm workers. This was outdoors work. In the houses of the aristocracy and the gentry, to an extent, and even some of the large farmers, there were also employed domestic servants. Here too, as in most job sectors, there was a distinct hierarchy. Butlers, footmen, hall boys, housekeepers, cooks, chambermaids and scullery girls, husbandmen, gardeners, stable boys, milkmaids, and so on. Below the laborers and domestic servants were the cottagers. They rented a cottage and a scrap of land on which they grew the vegetables for their food. Cottagers were not permanently employed as other farm laborers were. Instead, they offered their labor for sale at local market and were often just seasonally employed, say, during the planting and harvesting of crops. Vagrants, beggars, and the poor held no real status in society. Their position was curious because, on the one hand, their existence was taken for granted, in that by accident of birth some are born rich and some are born poor. Thus, in the contemporary view, there would always be the poor and vagrants. Dealing with the poor could be problematic, however, as there was no real social safety net to look after them. The introduction of poor laws was often meant to punish the poor, to motivate them to better their position by making the workhouses as miserable as possible, so that only the most destitute and desperate would enter. Private charity was always present, however, and in many respects could be seen as a, quote, Christian duty. The text goes into some detail on the issue of poverty. Assessing the nature of social relations in 18th century Britain, two interlinked concepts are important: patronage and deference. Patronage was the ability of a person or family to use money or influence to advance the interests of another person or family. It often meant finding a job for someone, getting them appointed to a position, getting a contract, even perhaps getting them out of a legal problem. Patronage was vertical. The patron or person did the action for someone below them on the hierarchy. To be a great man or lady was to be able to dispense patronage to one's clients. Patronage was a fundamental part of how the society and economy worked, whereas today we believe, or at least hope, that it is merit and achievement. Although almost all government offices, church appointments, jobs for laborers, apprenticeships for boys, commissions for artists and architects, assignments for writers, army and navy positions, etc., were distributed by patronage in this period. Patronage, however, was not looked upon as corruption. It was simply the way the system worked. Related to patronage, of course, was deference. In return for patronage, patrons demanded deference, which included indications of gratitude, loyalty, service, and obedience. Deference meant loyal service, deferring to patrons' opinions and wishes, including often voting in elections. It was visibly manifested, for example, by the lower order person tipping the hat at the presence of the patron, or moving to the side of the street. This visibly indicated that the person deferred to the other. Deference was not seen as being servile, but rather honorable in the society. As a late 17th century guide for farmers put it, a just fear and respect he must have for his landlord, or the gentleman his neighbour, because God hath placed them above him, and he hath learnt in the 5th commandment that by the father he ought to honour, is meant all his superiors. In the family unit, children were to show deference to their parents. The place of women in 18th century society was also secondary to males in the household, as children were to parents. In the paternalistic society, the young woman was dominated by her father until she was married, at which point she was dominated by her husband. Indeed, upon marriage, a woman lost her legal identity. As the great 18th century legal philosopher William Blackstone put it, quote, "In marriage, husband and wife are one person, and that person is the husband." A married woman did not own property, could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued. Divorce was extremely rare, and available only to the wealthy with political connections. Divorce was only legally possible by a private act of Parliament. Otherwise, marriages were ended by separation or abandonment, or, of course, death. Widows had more legal rights in society than married women did. The British economy was primarily agricultural. Before the Industrial Revolution of the later 18th century, manufacturing in Great Britain was characterized by the domestic or putting out system. Manufacturing was decentralized, located in cottages and hundreds of villages. Individual capitalists bought raw materials and supplied them to village craft people, paying a piece rate, that is, a set amount per piece, for the finished product. The capitalist collected the item and sold it himself. It was common for farming families to supplement their income by also manufacturing goods in this system. Capitalists, or those who had the money to invest in the operation, did best out of the arrangement, though at least workers worked at home with their families, and women worked along men in the cottage industry. This chapter, chapter 2 in the text, is titled The Whig World, which points to the dominance of the Whig political party in the first half of the 18th century. In English politics and government, there were two political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. Generally speaking, the Whigs were the party of the court, in favour with the king, the party of the aristocracy and the financiers. The Tory party was the party of the countryside, the landowners and the church. Tory political importance declined because of its tainted association with the Jacobite cause. Many at least were sympathetic to the Stuarts as the rightful claimants to the throne. Though unpopular, George I's position was never seriously threatened either by the rebellion of 715 or by the Jacobite plots of 1719 and 1722. In fact, these episodes served only to strengthen the Hanoverian succession. The text explores the nature of the Jacobite threat and its importance in England and Scotland. As noted in the text, Sir Robert Walpole was a towering figure in the 18th century political world, recognized today as being the first Prime Minister, though this idea was not known at the time. Walpole was the first Prime Minister in a modern sense, and also served longer than any other Prime Minister since. Entering Parliament in 1710 as a Whig, he advised both George I and George II. The South Sea Bubble brought Walpole to power in 1721, and he remained the leading minister until 1742. Walpole produced a plan to stem the disaster by transferring a proportion of the South Sea stock to the Bank of England and the East India Company. Part 2, Chapter 3, The British Empire in the 18th Century. This chapter examines the growing British Empire of the 18th century, examining the nature of Britain's growing international trade and questions of colonial governance and slavery. At the time, the British saw their empire as enlightened. compared to the Catholic and autocratic French and Spanish empires. In the context of the time, and in comparison to the French and Spanish examples, it was. But it was, of course, for the European settlers, not for the Africans or indigenous peoples in North America or even India. Colonial settlers did have it good in the sense that there were usually representative assemblies in the colony, and there were channels of redress back to Britain. This stood in contrast to the much less democratic Spanish and French empires. As the textbook notes, quote, "For Britons and other European settlers of Britain's colonies, the idea of an empire of liberty had considerable force." Like other European empires, the British Empire in the 18th century relied on African slave labor. To provide cheap labor to plantation islands in the Caribbean and North American colonies, the initial source was largely British or Irish laborers, known as indentured servants. Both indentured servants and African slaves suffered and were unfree. However, the indentured servant suffering was temporary and non-hereditary, whereas slavery was perpetual and hereditary. Of course, there were the other differences that slaves were African and viewed and treated as subhuman, where indentured servants were Britons or Irish who were either indentured as a punishment or, more commonly, chose to be indentured or bonded in return for a free passage across the Atlantic to the New World. Imagine bonding yourself to 5 to 7 years of back-breaking toil and suffering just to get a ship's passage for a new start in life. Enslaved Africans had no choice in the matter. The plantation islands of the Caribbean that produced export crops of coffee and cotton soon came to be dominated by the growing of sugar, and consequently needed vast supplies of labor to harvest and process the crops. Thus there developed a triangle of trade between Britain, Africa, and the Caribbean, and eventually North America. Most Europeans viewed slavery as an institution that had always been practiced, and the Africans were enslaved by other Africans and sold to Europeans for goods. Of course, the notion of slavery's history justifying its continued existence was based on a view of Europeans as superior to Africans. Europeans weren't to enslave other Europeans, just those who were somehow less civilized or even in some views less human. The sugar plantations made fortunes for their owners, who often retired back to Britain to become a country gentleman. That is, they very often bought a country estate, fixed or built a new house, and took their place in rural society, often sitting in Parliament, where they were keen to protect the interests of the plantation sector of the economy by, for example, supporting taxes on foreign sugar imported into the American colonies, and even for a time countering the anti-slavery movement which sought to end the slave trade and eventually slavery itself. The plantation, and especially its crop, sugar, had a tremendous effect on British society once sugar came down in price and soon became widely available and a staple of people's diet. It was in the 18th century and across the globe that British interest in the Indian subcontinent evolved from a primarily commercial one to a commercial and governing one. It certainly began as a commercial endeavor, with the establishment of the East India Company in 1759 and the establishment of trading posts in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras by the 1740s. The company began to acquire a territorial empire in India in the 1750s, as noted in the text, with the 1757 Battle of Plassey. Over the next decade, the East India Company acted more and more like a government, with an army, governors, and of course control of the economy and even levying taxes. It would not be until the late 19th century that Britain would take formal control over India as a British colony, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. After the loss of the American colonies in the 18th century, India would become Britain's most important colony, known as the Jewel in the Crown. The victory in the 7 Years' War over the French was significant. Often referred to as the First World War, the conflict between Britain and France was truly global, with battles in Europe, Canada, and India. Victory for the British meant the loss of French power in Canada, and then the necessity for Britain, as already discussed, an identifiably Protestant nation, to absorb 70,000 French Roman Catholic settlers in Quebec. The cost of the wars was immense and had profound consequences for the running of empire. The British national debt doubled because of the war, and the necessity of securing the gains made by military, forts, and troops was an expensive proposition indeed, and raised the question of who should pay for the defense of empire. The people in Britain, or should the colonists in the empire fund their own defense? Only the colonial legislatures could directly tax the colonists. Remember, the notions of British liberty that were to be extended theoretically to British colonists in the empire. So, to raise money to defend the North American colonies, the British government turned to the policy of indirect taxation through customs duties, that is, taxes on imports into the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 was particularly galling to the influential colonists in the 13 colonies. The issue of tea imports clearly showed the growing links within the British Empire. When the East India Company found itself with a great surplus of tea bought from China, it was allowed by the British government to export it directly to the American colonists. Although this actually lowered the price of tea for consumers in the 13 colonies, it greatly angered the important merchants who were thereby cut out of the lucrative part of their import business. Following the events known as the Boston Tea Party, the British government responded with severe measures, further alienating sections of the colonial community, which helped precipitate the events known as the American Revolution, but from the British perspective could also be thought of as a British Civil War or rebellion against legitimate authority. The loss of the battle to maintain the American colonies marks a fundamental divide in the history of the British Empire, so that historians often refer to the period after the loss of the colonies as the Second British Empire. A tremendous blow to British prestige, the loss of America caused Britain to pivot towards Asia and the Pacific in the expansion and consolidation of empire. To be sure, as noted, the British were already expanding their presence in India through the commercial East India Company, but this would only increase. The loss of the American colonies also raised issues of governance and questions of whether those colonies had been too lenient, giving too many rights and freedoms to colonists at expense of what was best for Britain. Going forward, colonies would have more rigid hierarchies and less representative government. In Canada, for example, the colonial legislatures would be subordinate to an executive figure, the colonial governor who was appointed by and responsible to Britain. Justifying the spread of the British Empire was often buttressed on the unspoken and awfully loudly proclaimed view that Europeans, and the Protestant British above all, were superior to non-European peoples. One legal doctrine justifying imperial expansion was that of terra nullius, or land that belongs to no one. This doctrine was premised not on the idea that the lands conquered by the British were unpopulated or empty, for that was clearly untrue, but that the peoples in these lands were not properly using them, that the political and economic structures were too primitive. Thus, in India, where of course there were ancient cultures and even empires, the British justified expansion by arguing that the declining Muslim Mughal Empire there, for example, was incapable of good governance, and the British were needed to prevent the descent into political chaos. Many British men returned from service in the East India Company with fortunes that they could attempt to buy their way into political power in Britain, often in rotten boroughs. These men, often referred to as nabobs, were often suspected of acquiring their fortunes through corrupt or at least exploitative and unsavory means in India. While wealth was celebrated in Britain, it was wealth gained from an old family with large estates and political influence. The upstart colonial adventurers, what might in a later time be called the nouveau riche, threatened this socio-political economic balance. These men who made their fortunes in the East India Company were able to do so because of the immense power of the company in India. The company was in many ways increasingly acting like a state, or at least a government. It largely administered British presence in India and had the powers of a government, even being able to raise taxes from the Indian population. By 1820, the East India Company's army numbered 300,000, though most of these were native Indian soldiers employed by the company, called sepoys. This shows how the company could run a growing empire with a small number of British administrators, but was reliant on the collaboration of Indians who worked for the company itself, and indeed helped enable the spread of British power and influence in India. The East India Company did not have a completely free hand in India, however, as the British government extended control over it in the late 18th century. In 1773, the office of Governor-General was created, which, along with the government-appointed Council of Four, ruled the company's territories. In 1784, a London Board of Control was established to supervise the company's operations. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, illustrated the seriousness with which the growing Indian colony was viewed from London. Hastings was an Indian scholar who deeply studied Indian culture and even spoke several Indian languages. As noted in the text discussion of Hastings and his trial, there was anxiety about the proper governing of the colony in India and what its effects might be for Britain and the British people. The British also sought territory, trade, and information in the Pacific region. The text notes the importance of explorer James Cook in his voyages, including to New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii in the later 18th century. Cook's legacy was an important one for Britain, although his reputation, as discussed in the text, is open to interpretation, especially the last episode and his killing in Hawaii in 1779. Cook's and others' voyages in the Pacific and beyond were important for imperial as well as for scientific reasons. The great scientific and philosophical period of the 18th century, known as the Enlightenment, had significant implications on government and social policies. Arguments and theories were put forth concerning the rights of individuals and the need to end abusive practices against people at home and abroad. This humanist and rational lens was turned towards the great moral evil of the time, slavery, and was part of the abolition of slavery movement. Activists such as William Wilberforce were successful in promoting a national discussion about slavery inside and outside of Parliament. The notorious Zong case highlighted the horrendous conditions of slaves in the transatlantic trade. The details of the case are gruesome, and the fact that the ship owners sought insurance compensation for the loss of their cargo at sea, since slaves were in fact property, was rightly infamous. The slave trade within the British Empire was abolished in 1807, but the institution of slavery within the empire itself lingered until finally ended by Parliament in 1833.